This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome back. We have two papers before lunch, and first by Teresa Cribelli, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Alabama. And she just told me, we hadn't met before, she just told me she was the last PhD student of John Russell Wood, who sadly died 5 years ago. And John Russell Wood was one of the leading British, maybe I should say Welsh, British historians of colonial Brazil, and an enormously productive scholar, and made a huge impact on the study of colonial Brazil. And Teresa is his last graduate student. She has a book, I don't know whether it's coming out with Cambridge, but it's not out yet, on industrial forests and mechanical marvels, modernization in 19th century Brazil. She's studying 19th century Brazil and particular issues of modernization. And she's chosen a subject that links very nicely with the first paper, because she says, I understand it, she's taken one of the better-known travel accounts of Brazil, Charles Mansfield's book in 1856, and she's then compared it with how a Brazilian scholar reacted to that book and wrote against that book. So we have a British view of Brazil and a Brazilian reaction to that view.
Exactly.
I got that right.
You have
Teresa.
gotten it right. Yes, so although I should qualify, at the time I wrote the abstract, I thought the author was Brazilian. He's actually a Spaniard who had become a Brazilian citizen. So that adds a little wrinkle into the conversation, but we will discuss this shortly. All right, so my paper today starts off with Charles Mansfield, who was an English chemist, and he traveled to Brazil and Paraguay and the River Plate between 1852 and 1853. He came back to London and died in an accident in his chemistry lab, but his letters that he had written back to his relations were published posthumously in 1856. Like many North Atlantic travelers, both British and travelers from the United States, he was dazzled by the geography and natural resources of South America and Brazil in particular, but he held a less favorable impression of the Brazilians and their Portuguese-descended black and mixed-race population. And he used very provocative language to describe them. He declared in his travel narrative that the only industry in Brazil was sugar growing, manioc eating, and assassination. So he didn't hold back when he was talking about the Brazilians. But he was also very thoughtful, especially some of his descriptions of Brazilian flora and geography, and some of the everyday scenes in Brazil are very interesting. In 1861, Antonio Diodoro DePasquale, and I'll show you, here's the frontispiece from his book. How I came across this book, I was in he wrote a rebuttal called the Ensaio critico sobre viagem no Brasil em 1852, de Carlos B. Mansfield. And so Mansfield wrote about a 100-page description of his time in Brazil. He was only in Brazil for 2 months before he went off to Paraguay. Diodoro DePasquale wrote a 300-page response to those 100 pages. And this is the frontispiece of the book that he published in 1862. And I've used this as for the cover of my forthcoming book because I think it really encapsulates Brazilian visions of progress in the 19th century, kind of this notion that Brazilian progress is going to emerge out of the natural fecundity of its tropical forests. So here in the front is the figure of an Indian who by the 1860s was starting to be used to represent the Brazilian nation, and he's pulling the curtains of the forest back to reveal this scene of progress, which is a little bit difficult to see. But if you look in the middle, there's a steamship, there's the hero of industrialization in the 19th century, the railroad, and then some of the features of civilization for Rio. Down here in front are the Arcos da Lapa, the aqueduct that was built in the late 18th century. And probably that building on top of the hill was meant to be São Cristóvão Palace, where the emperor lived. Anyway, so this is a scene of Brazilian modernity. that was at the frontispiece. So that's what initially interested me about this book. So, as I mentioned, Antonio Diodoro de Pascual actually was a Spaniard who eventually settled in Rio. He was a member of the Instituto Histórico Geográfico Brasileiro, or the IHGB. And he was quite the peripatetic traveler. He spent time, he was born in Castile, he lived in London, he lived in Paris, he lived in Italy, where he studied. He came to New York, where he spent 5 years in the United States. He traveled to Jamaica, Venezuela, Colombia, down to the River Plate, spent some time in Montevideo before eventually settling in Rio. So he was a polyglot. He published books on both sides of the Atlantic in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And he made quite a living for himself working in publishing, both in New York, Montevideo, and then eventually in Rio. So, and I'll come back to how does his Spanishness fit into this defense of Brazil. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a second. What was interesting, though, about this 300-page rebuttal and answer to Carlos B. Mansfield, and I think this is why DePasquale was really qualified to write this rebuttal, was he knew the British pretty well. He had spent time here in London. He was very conversant in British politics at the time. So one of the thrusts of his argument was that he argued that Britain was also home to barbarism and backwardness, and that the British they were being a bit hypocritical by pointing out the defects of Brazil. And he used the example of the British Antilles, right, and the poverty of the former slaves of the Antilles. And he also talked about the impoverished industrial workers and the unsanitary slums of the urban poor right here in London. He also he said one of his charges was that Europeans, and the British in particular, arrived in Brazil with notions of old world civilization. And it was true that the Brazilians didn't have grand castles, they didn't have the Tower of London, they didn't have the British Library, but there were there was a different kind of civilization in Brazil, and the Europeans needed to quit looking at the New World through the eyes of the Old World. Additionally, he also invoked this idea of a pan-Latin race, right? The French had been talking about this from about the middle of the 19th century, and it was an idea that kind of migrated over to the New World, and in fact that's partly why we call Latin America Latin, is that it was this idea of Latinness that was counterposed to the idea of Anglo-Saxons, right? The Anglo-Saxons who were setting out to colonize and civilize the rest of the world, which was something that was shared by the United States and the British. In the United States, we see it manifested in the term manifest destiny, that the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to civilize the New World. Okay, so Charles Mansfield was born in Hampshire, educated at Cambridge, and was based out of London. He departed for the River Plate from Southampton in 1852, and he was one of many, as Dr. Bell has just pointed out, there were many British travelers who came to the New World at this time. Charles Dickens was one of them, and I mention him because he also wrote a very critical essay, except it was about the United States, published in 1842, that the Americans weren't very happy about either. So the British had this tradition of writing very critically about the places that they visited. What's interesting about this, and I've used a bibliography compiled in the 1970s, so I'm not sure that it's absolutely comprehensive, but of this bibliography, there were 300 travel narratives identified about Brazil, 73 of which were British. The second highest number were Germans, then French, then Americans. So British travel narratives had an enormous impact in shaping perceptions of Brazil in the North Atlantic in terms of their sheer number. And I think this is a really important point to remember is when we're thinking about ideas of the global South, that the people who are publishing, who control the media, have a lot of power to shape how these regions are seen. And this is something that Brazilians are still very concerned about in their representations in the media. Among the more well-known accounts today, of course, Henry Coster published one of the first travel accounts of Brazil in 1816. Maria Graham was another important figure, 1824, and Sir Richard Burton published a 2-volume account about Brazil in the 1868s, and historians still use these very much today. Okay, talked a little bit about his publications. So one of the things that's interesting about Diodoro DePasquale is, how does this Spaniard come to defend British or Brazilian sensibilities? What's interesting about him, during his travels he worked as a teacher as well, and for whatever reason, by the late 1850s, he decided that Brazil was his home. And he apparently had developed a quite genuine affection for his adopted nation. He first off worked teaching languages and philosophy, and in 1861 he secured a very comfortable position in the Brazilian government as an official translator for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he worked until his death in 1874. He was a member, as I mentioned, of the prestigious Instituto Geográfico Brasileiro, which he became a member in 1859, and he regularly attended meetings, gave talks, and he donated material to the library. He also seems to have met with considerable social success in Rio circles. He counted the highest levels of elite Rio society among his peers, or the members of Rio society among his peers. And aside from his literary accomplishments, he was a very prolific writer. He was a proponent of magnetism, which was the sister movement of spiritualism, or the study of the invisible forces that shaped and molded physical existence. He apparently commanded attention in social settings with his charismatic presence, and he apparently also had a very attractive wife who helped with this. And at the same time, the modern reader gets the impression that he was a bit of a colorful figure. And I think he would have been at home in a Machado de Assis novel. So Juan Valera, a Spanish diplomat who later himself became a renowned novelist, expressed mixed feelings about his compatriot. He describes him, at times he gives off the impression of a great charlatan and trickster, at other times that he is mad, but in the end, and I confess this with some embarrassment, he appears to me to be a true sage who draws me to him and fascinates me with his fiery eyes. So it was in this context of his transatlantic travels and his fiery charisma that DePasquale composed his Ensaio critico and published it in 1862. Now, the Ensaio was derived from a series of lectures that he presented to his fellow members of the IHGB in late 1860. The Emperor Dom Pedro II himself was a member of the audience, so he heard these lectures as they were first delivered. And in 1861, he petitioned for permission to publish the lectures as a book. In 1862, he got the permission from the IHGB, and he published it with the Leimert Publishing House, one of the most prolific and prestigious presses of 19th century Rio. So this suggests that he had met with quite a high level of acceptance from his Brazilian audience, and that they supported this work and responded to it favorably, and that he really represented their interests. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the travel narratives themselves, what they were. They served many different functions. As I mentioned, the British were very prolific. They were written by merchants, sea captains. Maria Graham eventually became Lady Calcott, so she was from the upper levels of British society. And they were informational in the sense that they gave information to merchants and fellow travelers about how much food costs, where can you rent mules, how do you get from here to there, that kind of thing. But they also serve the function of just telling a good story about far-off places to audiences back in the North Atlantic who would never get to visit these places. And so some of them were quite dramatic and colorful, and they highlighted the adventure and exoticism of Brazil. And they also served another important function, that by highlighting the barbarianism or the lack of civilization abroad, it provided a highlight to the civilization achieved at home. And this is certainly true as well of the U.S. travel narratives. So that's something that's important to keep in mind when thinking about Mansfield's account. Because it was exactly this range of sentiments that he expressed in his book. As I mentioned before, he was entranced by Brazilian forests and spent much of his time describing the plants that he encountered. Interestingly, he always commented on Brazilian oranges wherever and whenever he ate them. Apparently, this is a theme I've noticed in a lot of, I don't know if you've come across this, Stephen, the oranges were very popular among travelers, which is something we've kind of naturalized today. But he also spent a lot of time talking about roads and railroads, how obviously this would have been interesting for travelers in general, but roads and railroads were one of the markers of civilization in the 19th century, right? The macadam process, which looks like a dirt road to us, it doesn't look like much, if societies that employed or used macadam roads or macadamized roads, signaled a certain level of civilization achieved within that society. I mean, I think we're a little more familiar with the importance of railroads. So it wasn't just the practical use of them, it was that they signified technological advancement and the ability to use technology to improve economic development, etc. So aside from all these positive comments that he had in terms of the railroads, which, by the way, were being built by British engineers, so there was a little bit of self-interest in promoting that, he really did not have much positive to say about the Brazilians. And this, I think, is what inspired Antonio DePasquale to respond to him. He said in one of his early letters, that Brazil must come to be tenanted by English or Americans. The degraded people who hold the land here now must follow the forests and be swept away, for I suppose they will never submit to be educated. And here, in 19th century British, I'm not going to say all of the British felt this way, kind of saw the Anglo-Saxon Americans as their cousins and their partners in this project of civilizing the rest of the world. And we see these sentiments, exact sentiments, mirrored in two U.S. travelers, George Catlin and John Codman in the 1860s and 70s, who kind of argued that we needed to bring manifest destiny to Brazil. Okay, so needless to say, such provocative assertions were not well received by the Brazilians. Brazilians were indeed anxious about the racial complexion of their society, and they did see European immigration as a way to whiten and therefore modernize their nation, but they also bristled at perceptions of their nation as racially inferior and backward. In fact, it was this Mansfield's charge of racial backwardness that most inflamed the sensibilities of Diodoro DePasquale and his audience. And this is where he really turned the mirror back on the British and criticized them for this idea of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxons. And he first, as I mentioned before, turned to the example of Jamaica, where the abolition of slavery 2 decades previously had ignited a debate back in Britain, in British circles, about how to ensure a reliable pool of workers. So the conversation was about whether to bring workers from India or China because they were having trouble, or at least this perception of trouble getting the formerly enslaved to work. And Diodoro DePasquale had been in Jamaica, so he drew on his own experience and kind of turned the lens back on the British, and he said, with no small amount of hyperbole, that the British had turned Jamaica into a hell more frightening than anything imagined by Dante himself, unquote. So he's using some very provocative language in response. And he said, the island streets were in shambles, its buildings in ruins, and the population was hardly active. let alone industrious and productive. As this was the best the British could do in the tropics, what did they think they would accomplish in Brazil? Okay. And if the British failure in Jamaica wasn't enough, you could always use the example of London itself. And here Diodoro DePasquale said, and I quote, "How would you respond, Mr. Mansfield, if we visited you, making a quick pass through the grand British metropolis to cast our eyes on London's poor districts, inhabited not only by the Irish covered in their rags, shivering in the cold, made thin from hunger? We would pull at our hair and exclaim, these English should be entombed at the bottom of the sea for their inhumanity and the sang-froid toward which they hold toward the suffering of their own." Okay, and here I think he was quoting from Flora Tristan, a French woman with Latin American connections who toured the poor districts of London in the 1830s, and she was commended by Charles Dickens for her travel narrative. But there was embedded within this example of British hypocrisy was a deeper observation shared by those within DePasquale's Rio circles. Brazilians argued that European visitors only peered at Brazilian society from the threshold, passing like meteors through their nation and making little effort to properly study and understand the Brazilians on their own terms. For example, Charles Mansfield didn't speak Portuguese, a barrier he himself admitted preventing him from talking to the Brazilians. How could Mansfield really get a sense of what Brazil was like if he didn't speak the language? The Brazilians, on the other hand, most, at least in the elite circles, could speak French. So they could speak to Europeans. They could read their books. They could hold conversations. And this is a big problem. Portuguese, and I think it still is, I know the Brazilian government's been funding the translation of Brazilian publications into other languages because not many people outside of the Portuguese-speaking world speak Portuguese. They call it the tomb of thought, right? So this was a problem for DePasquale. The other thing was that Brazil was a young nation. It had only been independent for 3 decades at the time of Mansfield's visit. So therefore, he argued, Brazil needed to be understood in terms of the progress it had made in those first 3 decades, and they couldn't compare it to Britain, which had had centuries of government institutions. So this was another way that the British were looking through their own lens and not understanding the Brazilians on their own terms. And here, Antonio DePasquale conceded that in contrast to Britain, where St. Paul's Cathedral and the Tower of London were truly magnificent British achievements, that the visitors had to pay to see these sites, right? And this was a reasonable expectation. But Brazil also had its delights. And here he mirrored a particular painting or strain of thought from the United States. The New World couldn't compete with Europe in terms of grand palaces and theaters and cultural establishments, but they did have this beautiful geography. And he said, you have to look at the land, and that's where our grandeur is located. And here he said that the magnificent leaves of Brazil's plants were its books, its manuscripts were the roots of the trees hidden beneath the earth, and its towers were the lofty mountains of the interior where nature guarded the treasures of creation itself. And unlike Britain, where you had to pay to see the grand buildings of London, foreigners had this available to them free of charge. It was all free to take in. Amended to this, he said, another failing of Carlos Mansfield was to give proper credit to the generosity of the Brazilian people. And this was something that Mansfield noted when he traveled through the interior of Brazil. He couldn't spend any money because no one charged him to stay at their house. Brazilians and fellow Englishmen alike provided horses for him to ride. And Diodoro DePasquale said, look at this ungrateful British person, this Brazilian generosity, even if we don't have a developed civilization yet because we're another nation, it displays the potential we have for development with this generous spirit of the Brazilian people. And so he chided Mansfield about this as well. I won't list all of the criticisms that he did. I'll just say a few more. He argued that in the case of law, Mansfield had commented on the corruption of Brazilian courts and the inscrutable Brazilian laws that made it difficult for the British to trade with Brazil. And he said, well, the British law was convoluted and Byzantine itself, and here he invoked Jeremy Bentham in this criticism, and he especially fingered the English common law, which he said was rendered the legal system nearly impenetrable to the layman and lawyer alike. True, British magistrates were less susceptible to bribes, but their interpretations of the law were tortuous and bent to serve particular ends. The law was too opaque. It could take anyone's side. And he said on the charge of Brazil being a land of assassins, that in fact Brazil, it's true, in Rio people had to lock their doors, but if you went into the interior, no one ever had to lock or shutter windows at night. Crime was virtually unknown. This isn't exactly true, but he said it's in fact London that has the problem with crime, and there are more murders in London than there are in Rio. Okay, great. So, and he goes on and gives many examples, which I think really displays his understanding of and his experience in England. So what evidence do we have that this book was well received? Like, what did the Brazilians think? Did they think the Spaniard was really representing him? Well, as I mentioned, he gave these lectures at the Igajabé to some of the most important figures of Rio and Brazilian society, for that matter. And I did find a review by Queen Dina Bocaiúva, who was a nativist, right? He changed his last there. He added Bocaiúva, which is the name of a Brazilian palm tree, to emphasize his Brazilian identity. He was a journalist and later a politician. He was very important after the establishment of the Republic. And he wrote a glowing review of this book, which he published in the Diário do Rio de Janeiro in 1862. And I'll read you just a few quotes that give evidence that DePasquale had really hit a nerve, at least with a particular sector of the Brazilian society. And I'll wrap up with this. I quote, "A commendable aspect of Senor DePasquale's book is his impartiality," which I would argue with, but he is not an author who attempts to hide Brazil's vices only by referring to its virtues. He recognizes the truth and has the noble courage to tell it directly, even though by doing so he runs the risk of providing fodder for other European travelers to write additional calumnies against Brazil. The ease with which foreigners fall prey to this defect when describing the people of the Americas is displayed in their prejudiced gaze and their assumption that we Americans are ignorant of European defects, even as they consider themselves well-informed in respect to all things American. So I would say that's a pretty strong support for DePasquale. He also asserted that the Ensaio critico was eminently national and did a service to the Brazilian nation in its defense of Brazilian civilization and the people. He extended his gratitude to DePasquale, and he hoped that it would teach foreigners to understand the different regions and civilizations of the Americas, while at the same time teaching Brazilians what they needed to do to overcome some of their internal challenges. So I will end on that note. I was talking to Stephen at the beginning. This was something that I had come across in the archives, and I finished my book now, so I can turn to it. So I'm going to develop the ideas a little more. So I'd be welcome for any suggestions of different angles I could go with this. But I think it's a really important piece in showing that, especially in the case of Brazil, the Brazilians didn't just take on English ideas of civilization. I'm thinking of Herbert Spencer's idea of the survival of the fittest. He was very influential in Brazilian circles. Or the idea that British modernization was the end-all, be-all, right? That there was some pushback to some of the more negative aspects of this relationship. So thank you very much for your attention today. I really appreciate it.